Welcome in to Daily Faceoff Live, your go-to source for everything hockey. Live every weekday at noon Eastern.
Just over 10 days since saying goodbye to Kyle Dubas, the Toronto Maple Leafs have their next general manager. Welcome in to Daily Faceoff Live. It's a Wednesday, May 31st edition, and Daily Faceoff Live is presented by Betano. The game starts now at betano.ca. 19 plus, please play responsibly. He's former NHL player, current Chicago Blackhawks analyst, Colby Cohen. Colby, how you doing?
I'm good, Frank. A lot of things moving around the hockey world the last couple of days. I can imagine your phone has been ringing off the hook.
Yeah, there's been a lot going on. Let's dive right into it, and let's start with the Toronto Maple Leafs set to introduce Brad Treliving, formerly of the Calgary Flames, as their 18th general manager in a press conference on Thursday. They were putting the finishing touches on his contract on Wednesday and expected to announce formally the decision to hire him on Wednesday afternoon. Colby, what do you make of the move, the Leafs finding their guy so quickly? Clearly, time was of the essence, but it kind of seemed like right from Jump Street, this was the guy that they had their eye on.
Yeah, and you told me that right off the get-go. I think that's who you thought kind of all along when they parted ways with Kyle Dubas, that Treliving would get the opportunity to become the next general manager of Toronto. And I think it makes a lot of sense because Brendan Shanahan talked about wanting experience and wanting somebody who's done this, who's sat in that chair, who's managed an NHL team before. And I talked on your show, Frank, a little bit about what type of experience they'd be looking for, because is Brendan Shanahan the one who's really making the calls, or is the general manager making the calls? But the one thing that I would say that I like about Brad Treliving in this situation is that he has experience in dealing with players who are coming up on the last year of their contracts, guys like Gaudreau, guys like Tkachuk, and he's seen the different paths that these players, these star players, have taken in order to leave as a free agent, or B, force their hand to get traded out of there. So you can argue all day whether it worked in Calgary's favor or not, whether he should or shouldn't have rolled the dice. But my argument is that he has experience in these exact situations. And as you know, Frank, you learn from experience in this business. And I do think that he's the right man for this job in Toronto.
Yeah, and I think when you are in some uncomfortable situations, that temperature is obviously going to be turned up quite a bit going from Calgary to Toronto, just based on market size alone. You mentioned you learn things. And you're right. Maybe those things he probably would have done a little bit differently. Maybe if you don't want to lose Johnny Gaudreau, you make sure you sign him 1 year out. If you don't want to lose Matthew Tkachuk, I don't know that would have changed, because he ultimately made the decision and went to them and said, hey, I don't want to re-sign here. And when you're faced with that, you have to make a trade and you're in an uncomfortable spot. I think he did the best that he could in that situation, getting a game breaker back in Jonathan Huberdeau this past season, notwithstanding, and a defenseman that they could add to their top four in Mackenzie Weegar. Again, like you said, you could argue as to whether or not those moves were successful or the right moves at the time. But being in that spot, gaining that experience, now moving on to Toronto and what they're facing with that core four, it's the perfect segue to our next topic. What is the number one priority on the Toronto Maple Leafs checklist? I'm going to make a bold, way too early prediction and say Sheldon Keefe comes back as Toronto Maple Leafs head coach, and all four pieces of the quote core four come back. What do you think?
I don't agree with you, Frank. And I do think Sheldon Keefe comes back as coach. And I do think that helps your bold prediction that the core four comes back, because I think these players all really like playing for Sheldon Keefe. When we've seen these other organizations move away from coaches in the recent history of the league, a lot of it had to do with player exit meetings. A lot of it had to do with what the star players told their manager, told their president of hockey ops, said in the media about the coach. It's not just hockey. That has to go across all the major sports, Frank. We've seen it in Philadelphia, both of our hometown, just with the recent firing of the 76ers head coach. So I agree with you that Keefe is going to get an opportunity to come back. I don't think Treliving is a knee-jerk type of guy. He seems to always take a patient thorough approach.
How many better coaches are actually out there? Like if you were to
agree.
make the move and fire Sheldon
Just to
Keefe,
do
you
it.
look at his record in the regular season, obviously in the playoffs leaves you wanting, but to compare it to some of the other guys that may be available as head coaches, how do the Leafs know that they don't already have what may be the best available candidate?
But I do think, Frank, I think he's going to be quicker to pull the trigger on Austin Matthews because of his experience, because of what he dealt with Johnny Gaudreau.
Meaning what? What does quicker to pull the trigger mean?
Well, I think that he's going to get in front of the Matthews camp and try to work out an extension immediately. I think if they feel like the extension is too far off, then I think he moves to plan B quicker. And I think that he looks at the market this summer, potentially looks at options to move on from Austin Matthews, because again, you look at that Johnny Gaudreau situation, and I don't think Gaudreau and Matthews are on the same plane. I think Matthews is a better player than Johnny Gaudreau, but Gaudreau is still a star. Gaudreau is still a 100-point player in the NHL. Gaudreau still walked for nothing. Now, again, Toronto, a different place than Calgary. I think players want to play in Toronto. I think it's a little different in Calgary, where you get some of these American-born players that feel too isolated away from everything that they know. So it's not apples to apples. But I think the clock will start immediately, and I think Treliving will figure out much quicker. He will not take a real patient approach, in my opinion, based on the history. So that's kind of what I mean when I say he will be quicker to pull the trigger one way or the other.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think at the end of the day, Austin Matthews' intention, I believe, remains to be with the Toronto Maple Leafs. I think it's all going to come down to his ask. Is it within the realm of possibility? Is it reasonable coming off of what was a pretty pedestrian for him 40-goal season? How does he get his game back to the level that he was at one season prior? And how does that relate to the ask? Because he's already one of the highest paid players in the league. How much further can you go? I think that's really going to dictate more than anything. Sometimes your actions and your ask speaks louder than your words. So we'll see what happens. The other news coming from Tuesday was the Nashville Predators moving on from coach John Hynes. Word leaking out actually before John Hynes was informed that they would be hiring Andrew Brunette as their next head coach. Interesting choice. Brunette has a connection with the Preds. He scored the first goal in Preds franchise history, played for Barry Trotz on that original Preds team. Barry Trotz saying in a press release, formally announcing the hire on Wednesday, that didn't really have a ton to do with it, but he loved the Preds connection. Brunette saying he feels like his career has come full circle now, having played in Nashville, of course. Interesting spot for Brunette to step into with the Preds. Felt like Nashville wanted to strike while they had the opportunity to get someone like him. And you look at his track record with the Florida Panthers. He took over in an incredibly unenviable position. Joel Quenneville was 7-0 when he was removed as Panthers head coach and suspended by the NHL. And Brunette just, I don't know, took the Panthers on to have a 122-point season and win the President's Trophy. Then they decide to walk from him, and he goes to New Jersey, and they exceed expectations this year as a member of Lindy Ruff's staff. What do you make of the hire? And I think more to the point, what does this say about the Preds moving forward in terms of how competitive they want to be in the near-term future? I feel like, Colby, they're kind of stuck in the NHL's murky middle.
Yeah, to me, there's some parts of it that make sense, and I don't buy into Barry Trotz saying it has nothing to do with the history between those two, because at the end of the day, Frank, we know in this business, these managers, these coaches, they want to bring people in that they're familiar with, that they're connected to, because these are the people that are going to keep them in their jobs. So I'll just start out by saying I'm not buying what you're selling, Barry. But secondly, I look at Andrew Brunette as a coach, and I look at the way Florida played. They played fast. They played up tempo. They played offense. Now he goes to New Jersey as an assistant coach. And I think a lot of people will tell you how instrumental Andrew Brunette was with that offense, with the way that the Devils played, the pace that they played. They play a lot of east-west. There's a lot of diagonal passes coming through the middle. Guys are coming in, coming out. The defense are activated. And then I look at the way that Barry Trotz's Nashville Predators are built. They're not a fast team. They've got some players that are making $8 million, like Johansson. I don't know what exactly Matt Duchene's cap hit is, but these guys are 30 years old. These guys are not high speed, pace pushing types of players. Now, Yossi certainly is from the back end, and Forsberg, who finished the year injured, certainly can play with some pace. But it was an interesting hire to me because, again, I don't think the personnel of the team matches the personality of the way that Andrew Brunette has run his bench. So
maybe that means that Barry Trotz will put his own stamp on the Preds roster this summer then.
Yeah, absolutely. You got to think they're going to look to get faster. They're going to look to get a little bit younger. They've got $15 million in cap space with about 15 or 16, full-time NHL players that are already rostered and under contract for at least one more season. Their RFAs and their UFAs are players that are kind of down at the bottom of their lineup, not real, heavily impactful players. So they did take in a ton of draft capital in order to make the trade with Tampa Bay. Okay. And maybe they use some of that as a sweetener to move on from Matt Duchene, Ryan Johansson. Maybe they're looking for partners to eat some of those types of contracts. So it'll be interesting to see. I think John Hines is a good coach. I think he's not going to be out of work very long if he doesn't get a job in this cycle. I think next season he'll be one of the first up coaches to get a job. I think John Hines' teams have always overachieved because his structure and his defensive-minded systems, which preach accountability. And I do think players like playing for John Hines. So ultimately, the merry-go-round will go, Frank, but I will be really interested to see what Nashville and Andrew Brunette are doing come draft time.
Yeah, you see the list of NHL head coaching vacancies. If we could throw that up again, there we go. There's 4 left currently. We'll get to that in a second with our inbox question of the day as to which one is the next one filled. But keep in mind that there's still a couple teams that could be added to this list. We predicted that Sheldon Keefe will be remaining as Leafs head coach, not official by any stretch of the imagination. Also, what about DJ Smith and his future with the Ottawa Senators, as they likely have new ownership incoming? So it could balloon to as many as 6 from the 4 current vacancies. Colby, let's take a look at the NHL buyout window, which opens 48 hours after the Stanley Cup final concludes, or June 15th, whichever one comes later on the calendar. But with the Cup final starting on Saturday, perfect time to talk about some of those candidates. I have a story that I just posted on dailyfaceoff.com listing these 5 guys right here. Kyler Yamamoto from the Edmonton Oilers, Mike Riley from the Boston Bruins, Mikael Granlund, he's with the Pittsburgh Penguins, not the Minnesota Wild, and Anthony Mantha from the Washington Capitals, and Ryan Suter from the Stars. Some recency bias there with Suter based on the way that his playoffs went. He could, if bought out, I still think a long shot, but could become the first player ever in the NHL's salary cap era to be bought out twice in his career. He's going to be making $833K, not a big deal, from the Minnesota Wild until 2029. Pretty decent work if you can get it. But of these guys on the list, Colby, who stands out to you as potentially being the most likely, or what makes the most sense to you?
Yeah, so I've gone back and forth with this, Frank, because I wanted to give you one, but I'm having a difficult time getting there, and it's because Granlund and Mantha are so eerily similar to me, even though one has 1 year and one has 2 year. Now, it's probably Granlund because he still has 2 years left on his contract in Pittsburgh. That is an aging team. They are going to have a new general manager. They've got their core of older players. They need speed. They need youth. They need to use that $5 million in cap space, and they need to get younger. They need to get quicker. You look at the way that his contract would hit them next season, $833, and then 3 seasons at 1.8.
Almost a $4.2 million in savings for this upcoming season, which, as you mentioned, would be critical for the Pens. My only question is, we don't know who the next GM is going to be and what they think on it yet, their thought process. And if you're the Pens, it also kind of further prolongs the pain. It gives you 4 years of Granlund on your books versus maybe just trying to cut your losses and retain some and trade him and just have him on the books for 2. What do you think?
Well, 1.833 for 3 more seasons is a big number, Frank, but we do know the cap is going to eventually start substantially moving upwards, right, and giving relief to some of these teams. Look, I think at the end of the day, this is a list of all possibilities. I think all these general managers are having these conversations right now. And at the end of the day, who's got the most draft capital? Who's going to be the most willing to part with picks. Okay, the Bruins, they gave up a lot this year to get Orlov. Okay, they gave up some to get Bertuzzi. So they're not sitting there rich with assets right now in draft picks where they can call Phoenix, or they can call, Arizona or Chicago, and they can say, we would like you to take Mike Riley. We'll give you a first or second round pick to do so.
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
They just don't have it. So at the end of the day, who's willing to go and try and they're all going to try to trade it. There's teams, Frank, bless you, that are willing to take on these contracts. I think Chicago is a great destination for some of these forwards. They're going to be looking to surround Connor Bedard with some veteran players. And we've seen Mantha be good. We've seen Granlund be good. I think you were right about Suter. I think he's the least likely on this list, but
he's still playing 20 minutes a night for a team that went to the Western Conference Final. It's not like they have someone knocking on the door in Dallas, as enticing as the buyout may be, to then take his job. So who's going to fill the void, and what do you pay that person? And is it just as easy to keep Suter for one more year at least?
I think so.
And then maybe he decides to retire after age 39. Who knows? You never know what could happen, but certainly Ryan Suter exposed. Check out the full list of the 5 buyout candidates for this year on dailyfaceoff.com. We had 7 buyouts that were conducted last summer. Let's get to the next wave with Stephen Ellis this week and talk NHL draft. He is Stephen Ellis, our prospect analyst at Daily Faceoff. Does a great job. His top 100 rankings were posted on dailyfaceoff.com on Tuesday. Received a bunch of questions, Stephen, from some NHL GMs wondering how you come up with your list. I said, this guy's an absolute maniac, watches more hockey than just about anyone I know. So when you take a look at your top 100, who were some of the guys that rose the most or quickest on your list compared to the last time you did it?
Well, the guy that really all season long has been a huge riser is David Reinbacher, and a guy that a lot of people probably didn't have as a first round pick heading into the season, but just the way he just kind of exploded in the National League in Switzerland, which is a fantastic hockey league. I think a lot of people kind of underestimate how good the talent is there. But he was out there playing heavy minutes, sometimes power play, penalty kill. Like, he could do it all. And then we saw him at Austria at the World Championship where he was injured, missed some time. He only had 1 point, but I thought he looked very steady. That was not easy competition for a team like Austria that had to fight their way to even stay in the group to begin with. So I'm very impressed there. Another one there is Nick Lardis, a guy that, I got to see him a lot growing up. He's from Oakville, where I'm from, and seeing him kind of develop, it was great to see him have this incredible second half. He got traded at the deadline. Everything seemed to work for him. He was putting up some of the best offense we've seen, and a guy that, may have been a third line player to the point where some people are thinking, late first round, early second round. So that's another guy. Gabriel Perreault out of the U.S. National Development Team, now the leading all-time single-season scorer in U.S. National Development Team history. That includes beating guys like Austin Matthews, Patrick Kane,
Colby
all those
going.
players. Yeah, yes, very true. But
that was in the first week.
Yeah, for just to see Perreault kind of evolve from this guy that seemed to be the trailer, to be the third guy on that line, put up the points, but wasn't the one creating offense, to the second half, especially kind of down the stretch, where it seemed like he was way more confident, playing with a lot more poise, and just looked much, much better. I think that's a guy that really is going to shake things up in the draft.
Yeah, and I think Perreault is going to get a good opportunity to take his time at Boston College over the next couple of seasons and really develop. His dad, of course, works for the Blackhawks. Yannick Perreault was one of the best face-off men who ever played in the NHL. So we'll see how those guys sort of shape out. But Stephen, my question for you, for teams picking in the bottom half of the first round, or maybe the last couple of picks of the first round, what player that's going to go late in that first round really has potential to become a number one center, winger, defenseman, a true star in the NHL?
Well, it's actually a guy that I didn't put in my first round, but someone I think definitely could be, and that is Oscar Fisker Molgaard, the Danish forward that played with HV71 in Sweden this year.
What a name.
Yeah, great name. And he just came off of the World Championship where he did have 0 points, but, he played, 13 minutes right off the bat, and he kept seeing his ice time grow throughout the tournament, which is positive. But, with the way he played we have 7 points in 41 games. That's not a lot, but in the Swedish Hockey League, it's very hard to get ice time for a young player because they're trying to win. Their goal is to be the best, and that doesn't mean developing players a lot of the time. But, his defensive responsibility was incredible. His work ethic, incredible. Just there's so many of these raw skills where, there were a lot of, he was kind of just an unknown prospect really until, it was like elite prospects early in the season was like, check out this guy. And then everyone started to get on board with him. And the NHL Central Scouting started to follow him too. So he's someone just, from a defensive responsibility side, he's not going to go out there and take dumb penalties. He's a very smart player. I think he's going to have a very good NHL career.
Steven, and just to remind everyone too, your rankings are also different than the mock draft. So be curious to line those two up once we get to draft week. But wanted to ask you wrote a piece recently about overagers. Is someone on that list that really stands out to you?
Yeah, the one position that is always very interesting when it comes to overagers is goaltending because you get more opportunity to really go out there and get more starts. A lot of the times the goalies that get drafted aren't even the starters on their own team. And that
more
actually
sample size.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually kind of the situation of Seattle where Thomas Milic plays and goalie of the year in the WHL, undersized goalie, but he had 6 losses between the regular season and the playoffs. Right now, he's in the Memorial Cup with Seattle, a team that also has Scott Retzlaff, who is one of the top goalies for the NHL draft as well. But, with him, he just, ever since that kind of the World Junior Tournament, he's just been playing some of his best hockey. And for a guy who he is 20, he is still eligible for the draft. He's 6 foot. He's not big. And that was kind of the reason why he kept falling. But I just think there's too much of a sample size at this point to say he won't get drafted. And I think teams are starting to learn their lesson that, maybe you got to go and look at that small goalie that's dominating the WHL because so many teams made the mistake of not picking Dustin Wolf, who I will say this. I thought he was a second-round quality player at that draft. It was stupid that he fell to the 7th round. And I think this time teams will be making a mistake if they let Milic go undrafted.
So give me a one-word answer. Number of goalies drafted in round 1 this year? 0.
I don't think there'll be a single one. I do expect a bunch to come in the second round. There's just no true number 1 goalie this year. I think that's kind of the problem.
All right, I'm going to give you 2. I'm going to say 2. We'll see. I'll give you another number. 4. That is the number of weeks until round 1 of the NHL draft in Nashville. Can't wait to be there with Steven Ellis. Thanks to Steven for this week's edition of The Next Wave. All right, Cole, moving right along to our daily Faceoff inbox question of the day, hashtag AskDFO. If you're watching on the YouTube stream, throw something into our chat. If you got a question for us, we'll be happy to get to it if we have a little extra time remaining in today's show. My question for you is, what is the next vacant position to be filled in the NHL in terms of, is it coach, is it manager, and where? What do you say?
Yeah, Frank, I think the New York Rangers are going to pull the trigger here on a coach soon. I do think John Hines becoming available.
I was going to ask you, you're a BU guy. John Hines is a BU guy. Chris Drury's a BU guy. Give us the scoop.
And not to mention, Drury and Hines were teammates at BU. They did have overlap. There is familiarity there. We talked about it earlier in the show, how important that was when I told you I didn't buy what Barry Trotz was selling about his relationship with Andrew Brunette.
Do you think the Rangers were waiting for this? Because a lot of people have made the point, as Peter Laviolette has been connected to New York, which was they've had a month to hire him. What more intel, what more info did you need before pulling the trigger for a guy who's taken 3 different teams to the Stanley Cup final and won once?
Well, look, I think this is a second hiring for Chris Drury, and he wants to take his time to make sure he gets it right. And I just don't think anybody has blown him out of the water. Here's the other thing I think is going on in New York. I think they've got their eye on the Pittsburgh situation. As much as everyone's going to say it has nothing to do with that, I do think they've got their eye on that situation. We're hearing it might be Dubas, then we're hearing it might not be Dubas. I just think that Drury is taking his time. He wants to make sure this is the right hire because
there's no chance Mike Sullivan breaks free. Is that what you're suggesting?
We know that these GMs generally get 2 hires, 2 head coaching hires before that seat gets really hot. And so I think at the end of the day, he wants to make sure that this is the right hire. So I think John Hines will get an interview in New York. I think they'll absolutely have some conversations. What happens? I don't really know. Peter Laviolette seems to be the front runner. You'd know better than me, but I think in the next few, couple of days, I think we'll see a new bench boss for the New York Rangers. And yes, I was making that connection.
Okay. Well, I don't buy it for 1 second that Mike Sullivan is leaving the Pittsburgh Penguins. Too much power, too many dollars, and he's wired right in there with Fenway Sports Group. My prediction, next position filled is the Calgary Flames. I believe that Gerard Gallant, speaking of the New York Rangers, too expensive, not a candidate. I believe they had an initial discussion, and the Flames are not willing and ready to pay somewhere in the neighborhood that Gallant would be looking for and accustomed to, especially coming off of that Rangers deal and what is left on the table for him this season.
Right,
So,
but if you're Gallant, Frank, don't you still get the difference from the New York
You still get
Rangers?
the difference, but why would you work for the same amount of money? What's the incentive to jump back in? Why not wait and see what happens? Get paid for the whole year and not work. That's
I don't
know about you, but that sounds pretty enticing to me.
There's only 32 jobs. You got to take them. You don't want to be too
I'm
passive.
just telling you that they've had an initial conversation, and that's not going to happen, at least from what I'm told. So my prediction is the Flames fill their job, and I still think it's going to be Mitch Love, their internal candidate, 2-time AHL Coach of the Year. Let's move on to our daily face-off Betano daily bet segment. Tyler, Game 1 of the Cup Final doesn't go until Saturday night, 8 p.m. Eastern in Vegas. First time we've mentioned the Cup Final this week in today's show. What do you got on your slate for betting?
Well, like we talked about yesterday, Frank, Betano has like 100 different things you can bet on. So I'm going to be taking the rest of the week here to just kind of pick apart some series props that I like for this one over at Betano. The game starts now at betano.ca. And here's what I have for tonight. They have a bunch of kind of pre-made matchups, Frank, between two players. Who's going to get the most goals, the most points in the series? And I love this head-to-head between Alexander Barkov and Jonathan Marchessault. And Marchessault, I mean, he's been a goal-scoring machine for the Vegas Golden Knights. He scored 4 in 6 games against the Dallas Stars. So far in the playoffs, 9 goals in 17 games. You look at Barkov, he scored twice in the 4 games against Carolina. That's solid, but he only has 4 in this playoff run as a whole. So Marchessault's more than doubled him. No reason why Marchessault can't take this head-to-head matchup in the Cup Final, Frank. I love
Especially
Marchessault.
for those odds.
Yeah, like you're getting it at pretty much even money here. I shouldn't say pretty much, close to even money. It's not like it's minus 150, minus 160. This feels like something that's really tilted in Marchessault's favor. So I like taking Jonathan Marchessault. Even though I have the Panthers to win the series, I like taking Jonathan Marchessault to score more than Barkov.
Well, and I like it especially to start the series. You're thinking that the Panthers, we're going to have a million rest versus rust conversations leading up to the final. How will that impact the Panthers? I don't know. Barkov hasn't been a point-producing machine, as you mentioned, so maybe this Marchessault can just pick up where he left off starting in round 4. Thanks to Tyler for our Betano Daily Bet segment. That brings us to garbage time. And Colby, speaking of the Cup Final, wanted to point out that this is going to be a very West Point Stanley Cup Final. You see here the owner of the Vegas Golden Knights and the owner of the Florida Panthers, both proud West Point grads who served in the U.S. Army. The Golden Knights are named the Golden Knights because he originally wanted to name them the Black Knights after the Army parachute team and had to pivot and name them the Golden Knights at the last second. Vinny Viola takes over as Panthers owner just about 9-10 years ago and has helped turn that franchise around. This is the best run in Panthers franchise history and certainly the most stable. So a lot of success. You see the impact on the front office as well coming from these two West Point guys in Matthew Caldwell that work and Holweg in the Panthers front office. And you know what's really interesting about this, Colby, as well? 2 West Point guys that are 2 very different philanthropists when it comes to giving back to West Point. Bill Foley's name on a bunch of buildings on West Point's campus. Vinny Viola, still a big donor, prefers to not be in the spotlight. So we've heard Bill Foley say before, Stanley Cup within 6 years. We all kind of laughed at him, but one of these men is going to help deliver a Stanley Cup for the first time in franchise history, whether that's in Florida or Vegas. Still pretty awesome.
I think it's going to be in Vegas.
All right, what do you got?
Viva Las Vegas. I think I like Vegas in 6.
Vegas in 6. Well, that was the exact prediction that I filed to dailyfaceoff.com earlier today. Who's your Conn Smythe?
Jack Eichel.
Same. Vegas in 6, Jack Eichel. I hate to agree with you.
Can you imagine Jack Eichel could potentially have a Stanley Cup and a Conn Smythe before Connor McDavid?
Well, not only that, hard to believe, but also the idea that he probably thinks this playoff thing is easy. Step right into the postseason for the first time in your career and hoist the Stanley Cup. That would be an incredible story. So many storylines to watch, but that'll do it for today's edition of Daily Faceoff Live. We'll be back with you 12 noon Eastern on Thursday. Until then, have a great day, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in to Daily Faceoff Live. Make sure you hit the subscribe button to never miss an episode.